Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my updated top 24 tight end rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about each of these tight ends on an individual basis, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, and of course, presenting statistics in order to justify their overall rankings, because many of you will be drafting this upcoming weekend. So I want to present this so that you can make the most informed decisions in your upcoming drafts. So with 24 tight ends to talk about, let's begin with our number one, and still my number one tight end going into the season, Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs. I understand that Travis Kelce in 2023 wasn't up to his normal standard. If you compare his 2022 statistics to his 2023 statistics, sure, it was a huge drop off, but he was still able to manage from weeks 2 through 22, 8.31 targets per game and 12.78 half PPR fantasy points per game. Now, one of the primary reasons why Travis Kelce's numbers dropped so significantly was because of the lack of touchdowns scored. When we look at Travis Kelce's touchdowns from 2020 to 2023, his total numbers consisted of 11, 10, 12, but most recently, only 5 touchdowns. Had himself a lack of utilization within the red zone, primarily because the offense for the Kansas City Chiefs weren't finding much success within the red zone over the course of the entire season. In fact, when you look at the 2022 Chiefs, they scored 59 total offensive touchdowns in comparison to 2023, which was 22 less total touchdowns scored. When the Kansas City Chiefs get back on track this season, with more weapons surrounding Patrick Mahomes, and they're far more capable of getting into the red zone, and of course, Patrick Mahomes finding his number one target. I mean, he's throwing behind the back passes to Travis Kelce in preseason games. He trusts him wholeheartedly, and going into the season, I do anticipate to see Travis Kelce get back to the top of the conversation at the tight end position. Moving to our number 2, the only other player within the S tier, of course, is Sam LaPorta, the reigning number 1 overall tight end in fantasy football half PPR. He came off of a season in which many of us expected him to get utilization, but did not anticipate as a rookie that he'd put together the greatest tight end rookie performance of all time. So going into year 2, the expectation is that Sam LaPorta should only improve, getting himself a greater rapport with Jared Goff, which should lead to more opportunities within this passing game and continue to build upon being the number 2 receiving option within this offense. Now, the reason why Sam LaPorta had himself such a huge workload in 2023 primarily revolves around the idea that Dan Campbell, the head coach of this team, was a former tight end in the National Football League. Additionally, used to be a former tight ends coach prior to becoming a head coach in the National Football League. So the expectation is that the tight end position will continue to be focused on. He will get himself more opportunity. And from what we have seen in each of the last 2 seasons with the Detroit Lions, whether Sam LaPorta has been there or not, tight ends for the Detroit Lions have scored 8 or more receiving touchdowns within the red zone in each of the last 2 seasons. LaPorta should continue to benefit from that overall factor and maintain within the S tier. Now, before I move on to the A tier and begin talking about Mark Andrews, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2024 season in order to help you capture a fantasy football championship. So in order to give yourself an edge besides these videos, you can also travel down to the description and get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. All you got to do is head on over to Underdog Fantasy and sign up today using code Andrew, making a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only will you be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, you'll get my draft guide, the associated rankings with the draft guide. Those rankings will be up to date every week over the course of the month of August. So regardless of when you're drafting, you have an advantage upon your league mates. But the emails won't stop there. I'll send you emailed rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, weeks 1 through 18, in order to help you capture that 2024 Fantasy Football Championship. So check out the right side of the screen, determine your eligibility based on your current location, and of course, draft responsibly via Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who have signed up with the code in the past or potentially aren't eligible based on the map, you can also check out the Patreon. Link is down in the description. You can find all that content and much more. Thank you very much for the support. All right, let's begin the A tier by talking about Mark Andrews. From 2019 to 2022, Mark Andrews had always ranked as a top 5 tight end in fantasy football. Unfortunately, last season had his season cut short due to an injury, but prior to the season-ending injury, from weeks 2 through 10, he was averaging 6.56 targets per game and 12.18 fantasy points per game. That's number 3 overall in terms of fantasy points scored and fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time. But if you expand those statistics over the course of a 17-game season, he would have been on pace for 111 targets, 81 receptions, 984 receiving yards, 11 receiving touchdowns, and 207.02 fantasy points, which would have made him the number 1 overall tight end in fantasy football in 2023. And it wasn't long ago that he was the number 1 tight end in fantasy football. You just have to look back to 2021. He has been a consistent option in fantasy every year. He continues to maintain as Lamar Jackson's number 1 option and the number 1 red zone threat of this offense in regards to the passing game, which of course we know how successful the Baltimore Ravens offense has been over the course of Lamar Jackson's tenure. And as we approach the future, Mark Andrews is only going to continue to benefit from that. Our number 4, we have Trey McBride of the Arizona Cardinals. Last season, he began the year as the second string tight end of the Arizona Cardinals behind Zach Ertz. Obviously, because of Zach Ertz's overall experience, skill, we expected Trey McBride to take a backseat once again. But due to the season-ending injury that took place early within the year for Zach Ertz, it allowed Trey McBride to really have a shot within this offense. And from weeks 10 through 18 with Kyler Murray, he was a dominant force for fantasy teams. Again, many of us led to our championships because of the efforts of Trey McBride. Throughout those weeks, he averaged 8.25 targets per game and 11.54 fantasy points per game, while being able to garner a 25.5% target rate, meaning 1 out of every 4 routes that he ran led to a target. The Arizona Cardinals in 2023 targeted their tight ends the most amongst all teams in the National Football League with 179 total targets. The primary reason that took place was because of their offensive coordinator, Drew Petzing, who came over from the Cleveland Browns and was a former Cleveland Browns tight ends coach. This is something very similar to what we talked about with Dan Campbell being a former tight ends coach and then, of course, now being the head coach of the Detroit Lions. When there is a tight ends coach overall influence and you have a talent such as Trey McBride, of course, we're anticipating to continue to see a high level of success. They're going to continue to feed him the ball. The only primary target competition he has is Marvin Harrison Jr., and as the number 2 receiving option of the Arizona Cardinals offense, has a lot of value going into 2024. To close out the A tier, we're going to talk about the thumbnail of today's episode, Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. Very similar to Trey McBride. He started the 2023 season slow, primarily because he was still trying to find his role within this offense. But Dawson Knox, early within the year, had an injury. He went to the injured reserve, and in the absence of Dawson Knox, Dalton Kincaid really took over this offense. From weeks 8 through 12 without Dawson Knox, 7.4 targets per game and 10.72 fantasy points per game. Now, once Dawson Knox did return from weeks 14 through 20, unfortunately, all of his numbers decreased, not primarily because Dawson Knox was garnering all of the utilization, but and really began to focus on running the ball between James Cook and, of course, Josh Allen. Throughout that span of time, Dalton Kincaid only 5.4 targets per game and 6.97 fantasy points per game. Going into 2024, we've all heard the potential of Dalton Kincaid being the number 1 receiving option of this offense. And I truly do believe that the Bills are trying to emulate their offense based on what the Kansas City Chiefs have done over the course of the last couple years in the absence of Tyreek Hill being able to just funnel target their Travis Kelce. Dalton Kincaid is going to be the Travis Kelce of this offense. In terms of target vacancies going into 2024, without Diggs, Davis, Hardy, and Sherfield, there is a 50% vacancy in total offensive targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Again, when half of your offense is missing because of those 4 players, again, there's a lot of potential for other players to step up, and we're anticipating that to be the case for Dalton Kincaid, who honestly is a wide receiver in a tight end's body that is going to continue to find success in 2024. Moving on to the B tier, we have Kyle Pitts, which, speaking of wide receivers in a tight end body, we have Kyle Pitts, who over the course of the last couple of seasons really hasn't been able to find himself much success. With Marcus Mariota, only 6.2 fantasy points per game. Desmond Ridder, 6.52 fantasy points per game. Again, not a lot of success, but that's mainly because of the quarterback play. It isn't his overall talent. You got to remember, he's one of the highest drafted tight ends in NFL history, and the talent level is certainly there. But can a quarterback come in and unlock that talent level? Well, that remains to be seen. Can Kirk Cousins immediately enter this offense and elevate the level of someone like Kyle Pitts? Because we saw most recently TJ Hockenson go from being a Detroit Lion and joining the Minnesota Vikings, and his overall potential of play increased tenfold. I mean, we saw TJ Hockenson in 2022. As soon as he joined the Minnesota Vikings, from weeks 9 through 17, averaging 9.4 targets per game and 10.87 fantasy points per game. And imagine, they had him practice all season long. It was a midseason trade. He immediately came in, and Kirk Cousins continued to give him targets. The following year, while Kirk Cousins was healthy from weeks 1 through 8, TJ Hockenson averaging 8.5 targets per game, 11.29 fantasy points per game. Now, over the course of the last couple years, from 2021 to 2023, throughout Kyle Pitts' career, he's only had 10 games of 8 or more targets. 10 games out of his eligible 44 healthy games he has played. In those contests where he's getting 8 or more targets, 11.13 fantasy points per game. We have seen over the course of Kirk Cousins' career that he can support tight ends. I mean, you can even go back to his early days within the Washington organization where he was able to support Jordan Reed being the number 2 overall tight end and the number 9 overall tight end from 2015 to 2016. He was able to support Kyle Rudolph in the first year that he, ended up with the Minnesota Vikings in 2018. Kyle Rudolph was a top 8 fantasy tight end. Again, we have seen Kirk Cousins love to utilize his tight ends on a consistent basis. And with Kyle Pitts having so much talent, we're going to continue to see that in 2024. Number 7, we have George Kittle, who, again, plain and simple, does not get enough utilization within this offense. But quite frankly, no one gets enough utilization outside of Christian McCaffrey. You know, guys like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, barely vying for 6+ targets per game on average, which again, isn't a lot of opportunities. So when we have George Kittle within this mix, trying to compete with Ayuk, Deebo, and Christian McCaffrey, it's difficult. Nonetheless, George Kittle still maintained being a top 5 fantasy tight end since 2018 in all of his healthy seasons. Over the course of the last 2 years, with Brock Purdy as a starting quarterback throughout the regular season, averaging 5.68 targets per game. Again, not a great number, but still 11.65 fantasy points per game. We can absolutely thank all the touchdowns, but of course, the level of skill that George Kittle has after the catch. Among all tight ends last season, he was number 1 in terms of yards per route run and number 3 in terms of yards after the catch. He makes plays after the catch, and of course, as long as you get the ball in his direction, is going to continue to dominate. Like I mentioned earlier, his overall target share is not enough. 20% is not going to cut it. In comparison to some of these other tight ends that are getting within the 30% range, we'd love to see George Kittle utilized as such, but considering the entire scheme of the 49ers offense, it's not going to lead in that direction. Maybe he'll lead to more touchdowns this year, which will continue to help him elevate. But amongst all of the receiving options of that offense, he was number 3 in terms of red zone targets, behind Deebo, behind Christian McCaffrey, and just barely ahead of Brandon Ayuk. But still, going into 2024, has a lot of value considering he's associated with the top offense in the league. Moving on to the C tier, we have Evan Engram. Many have been confused about my overall ranking for Evan Engram, so listen closely. I understand that he has been the number 5 and the number 2 overall tight end in each of the last 2 years and a half PPR scoring format within the Jaguars organization. And prior to that, found himself a lot of struggles and a lot of injuries within the New York Giants organization. But since joining this team, Doug Peterson, the head coach and the primary play caller of this team, really elevated him because of what Doug Peterson has done with tight ends in the past. There's a reason why the Jacksonville Jaguars, over the course of the last 2 seasons, have been number 6 amongst all teams in terms of total tight end targets. If we travel back to 2018 to 2020, the Philadelphia Eagles were number 1 amongst all teams in tight end targets. Doug Peterson has always had a top 12 ranked tight end in every single offense that he has coached since 2016. The expectation is that, of course, Evan Engram will continue to maintain as a tight end 1, but will he improve upon the stats that he produced last season? My biggest concern is the fact that with Christian Kirk in the lineup, it absolutely siphons away a lot of the slot receiving upside that Evan Engram presents. If we look at Evan Ingram's overall receiving statistics from the slot position in comparison from 2022, in 2023, the number increased dramatically. And the reason why that took place was because, of course, Christian Kirk had a season-ending injury. Throughout weeks 1 through 12 of the 2023 season, with Christian Kirk in the lineup, Evan Engram was averaging 7.45 targets per game and only 7.49 fantasy points per game. Now, once in fact Christian Kirk left the lineup due to his injury, from weeks 13 through 18, Evan Engram averaging 10.2 targets per game and 15.15 fantasy points per game, was able to save his season throughout the final stretch because of the absence of Christian Kirk. Going into this year, yes, Evan Engram is going to continue to be a featured option and perhaps maybe even the number 1 option of this offense. But nonetheless, the presence of Christian Kirk is absolutely going to limit his overall upside of potential. Our number 9, to continue to C tier, is Jake Ferguson of the Dallas Cowboys. Here's the fact of the matter. The Dallas Cowboys in each of the last 3 seasons have supported a top 10 tight end in fantasy football. Dalton Schultz in 2021 and 2022 ranked as number 9 and number 3. Most recently, of course, Jake Ferguson, as his first year as a starting tight end in the National Football League, finishes the number 8 overall tight end. So going into this upcoming season, we should continue to anticipate not only the similar numbers he produced last year from weeks 1 through 19, 6.33 targets per game, 9.66 fantasy points per game, but potentially an improvement upon that, considering this will be the second year within this offense. He'll continue to gain a rapport with Dak Prescott. They haven't brought in any additional target competition. He is still competing with CeeDee Lamb and, of course, Brandon Cooks. But he is going to be clearing away the number 2 receiving option within this offense. And considering he was number 5 amongst all players in the National Football League last season in red zone targets, number 13 in terms of red zone receiving touchdowns, if we continue to see the Dallas Cowboys utilizing Lamb and Jake Ferguson at a similar capacity within the red zone this season, and potentially even in more negative game scripts, considering the fact that their defense is going to take a step down this season, and their running game certainly won't be as crisp as it was in seasons past, the expectation is that there should be far more utilization and an improvement from Jake Ferguson this year. Number 10, we have David Njoku to close out the C tier. David Njoku is a player that, again, with great quarterbacks, can absolutely be unlocked and dominate. Last season, from weeks 14 through 19 with Joe Flacco, 17.22 fantasy points per game throughout those 5 games with Joe Flacco as the starting quarterback. But unfortunately, with Deshaun Watson over the course of the last 2 seasons, has only been able to average 6.83 fantasy points per game. But luckily, he has had Jacoby Brissett, he has had Joe Flacco to really elevate his game, after the fact that Deshaun Watson has tried to bury his lead within these given seasons. Yet, he still finishes the number 12 and the number 7 overall tight end, and we'll take that. But going into this year, there is a little bit of concern as to what his overall upside is if Deshaun Watson continues to tank his value due to a lack of opportunity and, of course, potential touchdowns within the offense, considering they're not able to score as much because of Deshaun Watson's overall efforts. What we have heard all offseason from Kevin Stefanski, the primary play caller and head coach of this team, he said that every game that they go into, there are specific guys that are trying to force feed the ball. And David Njoku is at the top of that list. And as long as they continue to give him those opportunities, as fantasy football managers, we should be happy with the potential that going into this upcoming year, what David Njoku was able to represent and demonstrate from weeks 14 through 19 of last year will continue to be their mainstay of the offense. And they're going to continue to make him the number 2 receiving option, only behind Amari Cooper, but at times perhaps even ahead of Amari Cooper. So considering the head coach, primary play caller is all in on that idea, we should have confidence going into 2024. To begin the D tier, we have Dallas Goedert, our number 11. So Dallas Goedert primarily benefits from the fact that the new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, is going to immediately allow him to step up in terms of his overall utilization and the potential for fantasy points because of the yardage and receptions that he's going to get. Now, when we talk about touchdowns, receiving options within the Philadelphia Eagles offense have not been relevant within the red zone in quite some time. So we're not even anticipating an uptick of receiving touchdowns. We're just primarily talking about receptions and receiving yards, really allowing him to step up. Now, when we see what Kellen Moore has done as an offensive coordinator over the course of the last 3 seasons, 2021, 2022, and 2023, he's been an offensive coordinator 2 of those seasons for the Dallas Cowboys, 1 of those seasons for the Los Angeles Chargers. In those last 3 years, those tight ends within those specific teams combined for a total of 179, 189, and 207 fantasy points within those given years. Considering Dallas Goedert is quite literally the only tight end that they utilize within the passing game, and as long as he is healthy, he's on the field the entire time within 11 personnel sets, or even 12 personnel sets if they want to have another tight end in there for blocking, we're anticipating to see Dallas Goedert with a lot of utilization. And considering Dalton Schultz associated with Kellen Moore back in 2020 and 2022 with the Dallas Cowboys offense was the number 9 and the number 3 overall tight ends within those given years, the expectation is that Dallas Goedert should get back into being within the top 12 conversation at the tight end position. Again, all he has to do is stay healthy. Number 12, to close out the tight end 1 conversation, we have Brock Bowers. So when we talk about the history of success of rookie tight ends coming into the league and being immediate impact players, especially those who are first-round selections, there isn't really many. When we talk about the last 9 first-round drafted tight ends since 2014, so since the last decade of football, there have only been 3 tight ends that finished as tight end 1s within their rookie campaign. Those tight ends being Evan Engram, Kyle Pitts, and Dalton Kincaid. Now, we've already mentioned all 3 of those players thus far this video, and hopefully Brock Bowers can get himself within that conversation and continue the streak of success for tight ends who were given ample opportunity within their rookie year. Primarily because Evan Engram, Kyle Pitts, and Dalton Kincaid, all within their rookie year, were given 90 targets minimum. So if in fact the new offensive coordinator of the Las Vegas Raiders, Luke Getsy, is going to come in and immediately make an impact by getting the ball to their first round selection. Luke Getsy, formerly of the Chicago Bears as their offensive coordinator in the last 2 years. In the last 2 years, he has helped elevate Cole Kmet to being a top 7 fantasy tight end in each of those 2 seasons. Primarily in 2023, Cole Kmet had 90 targets. So the opportunities are going to be there for Brock Bowers. He is far too talented within this offense to be anything less than a top 12 tight end. He should be the number 2 receiving target behind Davante Adams. If in fact he's still the number 3 receiving option after Jacoby Myers, he can still find himself top 12 value. All he has to do is score himself 5 to 6 touchdowns within the given year, which he is certainly capable of doing so with Gardner Minshew at quarterback. Our number 13 to begin the E tier is Dalton Schultz. Dalton Schultz is ranked as a top 12 tight end in fantasy football in each of the last 3 seasons. And even though I'm projecting him as number 13, it suits him primarily because of the target competition within the Houston Texans organization. We've all seen it. We've all talked about it. Diggs, Collins, Dell. On top of it, Joe Mixon shouldn't be slept on as a receiving threat within this offense. But nonetheless, when we look at 2023 Dalton Schultz, within his first year in this offense, only 5.7 targets per game. Honestly, those numbers are probably going to stay very similar this year, and only 8.12 fantasy points per game, which, again, those numbers should look very similar going into 2024. The only reason I feel confident that he's going to maintain his value is because of the offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick. He's a former 49ers passing game coordinator in seasons past. We know that, of course, the 49ers, Kyle Shanahan, the influences there within that offense always have George Kittle on the field. Dalton Schultz is going to be the George Kittle of this offense. He's always going to be on the field. He's always going to be utilized. And even though he is going to be the fourth receiving option of this offense, similar in the way in which, George Kittle is behind Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and Christian McCaffrey, that's the situation that Dalton Schultz is, the number 4 receiving option behind Dell, Collins, and Diggs. Is there enough opportunity? I believe so. This is going to be a pass-heavy offense in 2024. Number 14, we have Pat Freiermuth, who primarily benefits from the fact that we have a change at quarterback and offensive coordinator. Now, in seasons past, Pat Freiermuth has proven that he can be a top 12 fantasy, just most recently in 2022. But over the course of the last 3 seasons, hasn't really been given a lot of opportunity. Last season dealt with a lot of injuries and inconsistency at play in regards to the quarterback position last year. I mean, we had guys like Trubisky, Pickett, and Rudolph that obviously weren't great. But when you give him ample opportunity, since 2021, 5 or more targets per game, Pat Freiermuth is averaging 9.37 fantasy points per game. So hopefully the new offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith, coming in from the Atlanta Falcons, the former play caller of that organization. I mean, the Falcons targeted their tight ends 174 times last year, third amongst all teams in the National Football League. Both Jonnu Smith and Kyle Pitts had over 50 receptions in 2023. So if all those targets are going to be funneled in a singular direction of Pat Freiermuth as the number 2 receiving option only behind George Pickens within this offense, Russell Wilson should absolutely be looking in the direction of Pat Freiermuth, especially considering this offensive line is falling apart, and Russell Wilson's going to have to get the ball out of his hands as quickly as he possibly can to protect himself. Number 15, we have Taysom Hill. I think this overall ranking is relatively fair, but I would not be surprised if he outpaces it. The last 2 seasons, he has finished as tight end number 5 and number 10. So based on his overall fantasy point production, it would not surprise me that if in 2024, he's able to continue his streak of success, he's going to be a top 12 tight end once again. And he is one of my favorite tight ends to take as my tight end 2 in almost every single one of my drafts outside of TJ Hockenson, primarily because, again, his value is dropping even further than number 15. But over the course of last season, Taysom Hill, on a per-game average, 8.44 fantasy points per game in games in which he had 10 snaps or more within the game. Again, we're not asking for much. He just needs to be on the field a couple times. Last season, in games in which he had 5 rushing attempts or more, 13.57 fantasy points per game. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, in which he has had games of 10 touches or more, 14.84 fantasy points per game. The new offensive coordinator, Clint Kubiak, again, the prior rankings video that I had within the tight end position, I was very uncertain of Taysom Hill's role. He has already gone ahead and defined his role purely. He's a running back, he's a fullback, and he's a tight end. He's running the ball out of the backfield. He's getting fullback dives for, red zone touchdowns, and he's running routes as a tight end, at the end of the line of scrimmage. The fact of the matter is he's going to continue to get himself a high level of utilization. With Juwan Johnson still dealing with an injury, Taysom Hill is not just the primary number 1 tight end of this offense, but the Swiss Army knife that is going to continue to benefit from the overall utilization and, of course, his skill. Number 16 to close out the E tier. I've moved down TJ Hockenson quite a bit, primarily because, again, he is going to miss a significant amount of time. And we talked about the level of success TJ Hockenson has had when we talked about Kyle Pitts just moments ago, the relationship that Kyle Pitts should be able to increase his overall play based on Kirk Cousins' overall presence. But when we talk about what Hockenson did last season, prior to his injury, weeks 1 through 15, the number 2 overall tight end in terms of fantasy points, number 3 in terms of fantasy points per game on average, 11.69 fantasy points per game. And a lot of those games were without Kirk Cousins. From weeks 9 through 15 was averaging 9.12 targets per game and 12.23 fantasy points per game without Kirk Cousins in the lineup. The quarterbacks were Josh Dobbs and Nick Mullins throughout that span of time. But unfortunately, after week 15, tore his ACL. Season-ending injury. So going into 2024, considering he had his surgery completed on January 29th, 2024, and there is a 9-month recovery process, the expectation is that he should not be on the field until November. So if he's going to miss the first 7 to 8 weeks, let's say he's ahead of schedule. Let's say he only misses 7 games going into this upcoming season. They have a week 9 bye. So unless you have a tight end already on roster that has a bye week after week 9, the selection of TJ Hockenson is a little sketchy already, because then you're going to have to get a third tight end on roster. Outside of that, this investment is purely for the final 6 games of the season in terms of regular season fantasy football going into the fantasy playoffs if you're able to make it. It's an investment you put on your IR spot. As soon as you're done with your draft, you're hitting the waiver wire and you're picking up another player because he immediately slots in within the IR. Again, he is a long-term investment, but one I think is certainly of value. Even with Sam Darnold at quarterback, he is going to be heavily utilized because Kevin O'Connell deems it to be so. Number 17 to begin the F tier is Hunter Henry. There's been a lot of conversation regarding Hunter Henry, his health this offseason, and him, getting utilization within training camp. But the fact of the matter is, regardless of who's going to play quarterback, he really does not have much target competition. And the fact that we have a new offensive coordinator change, bringing in Alex Van Pelt, the former OC of the Cleveland Browns, from 2021 to 2023, with Alex Van Pelt as the OC of the Browns, they were number 3 in terms of tight end targets in Cleveland. Therefore, the expectation is that Hunter Henry, without Mike Gesicki in his back pocket, should be dominating. This is a tight end that just back in 2021 was the number 9 overall tight end with 50 receptions, 603 receiving yards, and 9 receiving touchdowns. Last year, obviously, had to deal with the fact that he had, unfortunately, some poor quarterback play, but poor play calling over the course of the entire season. So with the dysfunctional offense now being improved upon, with a new OC, with new quarterbacks, the expectation is that Hunter Henry should be the number 1 receiving target of this offense going into 2024, and additionally should be the number 1 receiving threat for the New England Patriots. They're not going to score often, but when they do, it will be Hunter Henry benefiting from that. Number 18, we have Cole Kmet. Speaking of benefiting from touchdowns recently, Cole Kmet over the course of the last 2 seasons, caught himself 7 touchdowns and has gotten himself to be the number 7 overall tight end in each of the last 2 seasons minimum. So if we're going to continue that pace, if he's going to score himself a lot of touchdowns, get himself, 90 targets like he did last year, then of course he'll be in the mix and he'll continue to be a tight end 1. But I don't anticipate to see that once again this year, primarily because of the target competition of DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze, DeAndre Swift, and also the fact that Shane Waldron is bringing in Gerald Everett, a former tight end that he has coached in Seattle and with the Los Angeles Rams. So with that all taken into account, and the fact that Shane Waldron's Seattle Seahawks offenses over the course of 2021 to 2023 have targeted their tight ends the 15th most times throughout that span of time. Again, not the greatest overall numbers, but Noah Fant back in 2022, the best overall ranking he had and the best overall tight end ranking Shane Waldron has supported as a Seahawks OC was number 18 overall tight end in 2022 with Noah Fant playing 17 games. I understand Cole Kmet is coming off of a season that between weeks 4 through 16 was averaging 10.26 fantasy points per game, but I think those days are over based on the target competition. Number 19, we have Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin has been very low-key, but very consistent for fantasy purposes as a tight end 2. Over the course of the last 3 years, he is ranked as tight end 20, 16, and 18. He never misses time due to injury, and he gets a massive upgraded quarterback with Aaron Rodgers now leading the New York Jets offense. Last season within this offense with Zach Wilson, of course, at quarterback, sometimes, of course, Trevor Siemian, just depending on what week it was, but nonetheless, in games in which Tyler Conklin was given 5 or more targets per game, was still averaging 6.88 fantasy points per game. I understand that's a low number, but Tyler Conklin did not score a single touchdown last year, primarily because the Jets were historically bad in 2023 in terms of total offensive touchdowns scored. They were last in the National Football League. With Aaron Rodgers, that's no longer going to be the case. There will be more utilization, hopefully within the red zone for Tyler Conklin, in which he can be a spot start or a solid tight end too that may have upside as the season progresses. Moving on to the G tier, we have Cade Otton. I thought about putting Cade Otton within the F tier because he certainly could put up very similar numbers to Hunter Henry, Cole Kmet, in the idea that he's going to be a main benefactor within the red zone for touchdowns. Now, again, he's a big target, but he's going to have to compete with Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and of course, Rachaad White. So I thought within this overall tier, he's safe. And he's still a solid tight end too, primarily because last year, he finished as tight end number 19 overall. And now he gets a bump in terms of his overall offensive coordinator. They bring in Liam Cohen, who was a former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams back in 2022. Within that season, Tyler Higbee finishes the number 9 overall ranked tight end in fantasy football. Tyler Higbee that season, 108 targets, 72 receptions, 620 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns with 116.0 fantasy points. Now you have to understand the 2022 Los Angeles Rams, outside of Cooper Kupp, they had nobody. And after Cooper Kupp left, it was the Tyler Higbee show. So Cade Otton, as much as I'd love him to be able to get into that top 12 conversation and be one of these tight ends who's able to accomplish that for the first time in his career, I'd love to see that in 2024. Unfortunately, it is really a long shot for that to take place. A couple of the factors that keep him within the conversation of still being a tight end 2 is the fact that last season he never left the field. He played 90% of the offensive snaps in every single game, and he shouldn't leave the field anytime soon. Maybe if in fact Baker Mayfield starts to favorite him as a target going into this season, there's a chance for him to climb the rankings. But outside of that, just a solid low end tight end 2. Number 21, we have Jonnu Smith. I've talked about Jonnu Smith ad nauseum over the course of the last couple live streams. Many of you guys have asked me what are players that you are, really trusting in terms of deep sleepers. I like, guys like Jonnu Smith. I like guys like Joshua Palmer, guys that are underrated, but certainly have a potential going into this upcoming season with a lot of uncertainty within their offenses to find value. Jonnu Smith last season finished as the number 17 overall ranked tight end. In games in which he had 5 or more targets last year, was averaging 9.14 fantasy points per game. What we have witnessed from the Miami Dolphins offense over the course of the last couple years is that they do not like to utilize the tight end position. In fact, last season they were dead last in tight end targets with only 52. So why sign Jonnu Smith? Why sign a receiving capable tight end unless Mike McDaniel had in his mind a scheme that he was going to implement in 2024 that was going to heavily utilize the tight end position? If you look at 2022, when Mike McDaniel joined the organization, as a former run game coordinator of the 49ers, he immediately impacted the offense in 2022 by getting a lot of utilization out of Tyreek Hill and, of course, Jalen Waddle. Everybody else suffered. In 2023, he maintained the receiving utilization of those guys, but then focused on the running game, getting Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane within the top tier of the conversation. Now, going into 2024, very similar to the way that Kyle Shanahan runs his offenses, besides getting himself a lot of utilization with his running backs, elevating his wide receivers within the overall scheme, he has a stud tight end by the name of George Kittle. And I think the George Kittle of this offense going into 2024 is going to be Jonnu Smith. He's going to get himself a lot of utilization. I promise you that the Miami Dolphins will not be last in tight end targets once again. They're going to continue to get this young athletic tight end the ball in open space and allow him to make plays. I mean, we've even seen Jonnu Smith take snaps out of the backfield over the course of the last couple of years within different offenses. He is a very capable player, and quite frankly, I expect him to be one of these sleeper options at the tight end position. Moving on to Luke Musgrave, our number 22. Luke Musgrave has potential. To begin last season, in games in which he played 60% or more of the offensive snaps, was averaging 6.22 fantasy points per game. And even though those aren't the greatest numbers, the fact of the matter is there is a lot of target competition within the Green Bay Packers offense. We still don't know who the number 1 receiving target is. And quite frankly, there may not be a number 1 receiving target. So if we're going to just value Luke Musgrave on the idea that anybody can score in any given week for the Green Bay Packers, and maybe we want to take advantage of the idea that he has a pretty decent upcoming strength of schedule, Luke Musgrave may be, in fact, on a route to where he could find himself a lot of success. Now, the biggest risk that revolves around Musgrave is the fact that Tucker Kraft is also within this offense. And after Musgrave had his midseason injury, Tucker Kraft really did show that he is just as good at the tight end position. Number 23, we have Chigoziem Okonkwo, who last season I thought was going to be far better than he was. Over the course of the last couple years, he's been a decent tight end when given opportunity, but quite frankly, the Tennessee Titans offense last year wasn't really in a position to give their tight ends opportunity. But maybe in 2024, with Brian Callahan, their new primary play caller, the former OC of the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cincinnati Bengals over the course of the last 3 seasons have been able to produce the number 19, the number 23, and the number 29 overall tight end in fantasy football. They targeted their tight ends last season 115 total times. So if Chigoziem Okonkwo is going to be given ample opportunity, last season in games in which he was given 5 or more targets per game, 7.35 fantasy points per game, there is a potential within a lot of 11 personnel sets for him to be on the field almost all the time. And of course, be the primary receiving tight end of the Tennessee Titans offense. To close out today's video, we have Ben Sinnott, the rookie tight end of the Washington Commanders. The primary reason he jumps into this conversation has to do with the most recent trade of Jahan Dotson going to the Philadelphia Eagles and opening up more receiving usage for a guy like Ben Sinnott. Now, I understand Zach Ertz is still within this lineup, but Zach Ertz has found himself injured in a lot of scenarios over the course of the last couple of years. And the primary reason, Zach Ertz was brought into this offense is because he already has a rapport with Cliff Kingsbury. Cliff Kingsbury traded for Zach Ertz back in 2021. He helped Zach Ertz accomplish a top 5 tight end standing within the given year. But since then, Ertz, of course, has been getting injured every year. So if Sinnott's going to come in, a second-round draft pick, and he's going to already take first-team reps away from Zach Ertz within training camp, and we no longer have Jahan Dotson playing within the slot receiving role within this offense, and they're going to run a lot of 12 personnel sets, there is a lot of potential in which Ben Sinnott can very easily overtake Zach Ertz, become the primary slot receiving option of this offense, and find himself to be the security blanket of the rookie quarterback, Jayden Daniels, which honestly would not surprise me. That's why I have him in this conversation. And going into 2024, I'm hoping he can find himself a lot of success. All right, guys, that's going to cover it for my top 24 tight end rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Hope you guys enjoyed today's content. If you did, click the like button down below. Support the channel if you guys have not yet already by, of course, subscribing. We are on our way to 100,000 subscribers. Thank you very much. Additionally, if you guys want my all-expansive rankings in terms of top 40 quarterbacks, top 50 tight ends, top 80 running backs, top 120 wide receivers, top 200 flex, half PPR, full PPR, top 32 kickers, top 32 defenses. You want all that? You can either check out Underdog Fantasy using code Andrew, making that first time deposit minimum of $10. You'll get rankings all season long, or you can check out the Patreon where you can find all that content and much more. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.